The power of the four archetypes on our path of healing and growth is quite incredible, maybe even magical. This week's episode is with Rod Boothroyd. Rod is actually a friend and past mentor. Rod brings more than 2 decades of experience of working with men and women to his current work as a Healing the Shadow practitioner. And in this show, we explore the profound themes of archetypes and leadership. Rod shares how his own journey into archetypal work began after a midlife crisis and the significance of the four archetypes of the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover, both for him personally and then how they went on to influence his work with others. We discuss the universal nature of these archetypes. We reflect on their relevance to both men and women and illuminate how to harness their power on the journey of healing and embodying one's true self. And before we jump into all of that good stuff, if you are struggling with the challenges of walking your soul path in this crazy modern world and you would benefit from guidance, support, and kinship, come join us at our Academy of the Soul, Unio. You can find out more and join us by hopping on over to bemythical.com/Unio now, or click the link in the description. And now, back to the show. Let's dive in. Hello, Rod. A huge, warm, and might I say, long overdue welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Leanne. It's so kind of you to have me on here. And I'm delighted to see you again after quite a break, really.
Oh, it is. This is such a pleasure to reconnect after a good few years. But I also feel this sense of, and I was saying this to Jonathan, I can't work out why I've not invited you on sooner. Clearly, this was meant to be the perfect time, but there is definitely this part of me of like, I can't understand why we've not done this before, which is all on me, not you, just to say. But here we are, and I'm delighted that we are.
Yeah, absolutely fabulous to see you again. And I hope this can be at least helpful, if not informative and useful as well.
Well, I already have like insider understanding that I absolutely know listeners are going to love this because I've been blessed to have been the recipient of your wisdom and your heart and your intuition and all the things I suspect will kind of be clear to listeners as we weave into this topic. But, you know, fundamentally, the work that we're going to talk about, the understanding the archetypes, my goodness, again, I've had, been very, very fortunate to experience that firsthand. And I cannot wait for listeners to hear about the magic that you weave.
Well, thank you. So I suppose the place to start is how I got into this work.
Yes. And feel free. I just want to say, I would love to really go back to, I think, for many people, there is like this point in our journey. And sometimes we can look back, right back into childhood and actually see kind of like echoes, whatever the opposite of echoes is in the past. We can see sometimes it's like seeds of that in our childhood. But there's often this like archetypal moment, like milestone in our journey that kind of, if we've really ignored that call of the soul, that like really thrusts us into it. So I would love to start there. Like, what was that for you?
Well, I think what popped into my mind, so I'll give voice to it, is that I came from a family where there wasn't a great deal of emotional awareness. Big surprise, of course. Didn't most people, probably most people listening to this podcast. But I think the way that benefited me was that I developed a part of myself which was very, very skilled at working things out. And beyond working things out, a real sense of intuition about what might happen, be required, was needed, and so on. So I take that gift forward through life to a point where I suppose a midlife crisis happens. I collapse emotionally and physically and financially to some degree. And I need to find a way out of that mess. So this is not uncommon. Many of the people listening to this podcast will recognize the midlife crisis. To me, that's simply a point in life where the pressure of not following your heart or your natural talents and abilities becomes so great that the world chooses to make you aware of the fact that if you carry on doing what you're doing, the outcome is going to be bad for all concerned. And for me, that point was where I was made redundant. Typical
What
male
had you
thing.
been doing? Like, what was your life just before that?
Well,
I've only ever known this version of Rod, and I'm intrigued to know what,
thanks for asking.
the other version was.
I was a manager in a multinational company, a bit like yourself, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. And I was made redundant, and that was like the end of my world, because my vision at that point was limited to the salary every month, the daily grind, as I would look back on it now, and so on. So it caused me to collapse really into a place that I'd describe in retrospect as one of high anxiety. I was going to say despair, but I don't think I ever despaired. So the anxiety led me to realize I needed some therapy. So I went off to get that. And I was fortunate enough to discover two of the most amazing therapists. You know, I to this day can almost judge the quality of a therapist by two things: their compassion and their willingness to step outside convention. You know,
I love that. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was fortunate enough to meet two of them. One who trained the others, so I worked with both of them over time. And one of them said a phrase that has always stuck in my mind: I will do anything in the service of the client as long as it is ethical. And I think in that you have the template for where I went, because they trained me in turn. And that really helped me get over the crisis and have enough confidence to believe if I launched myself on the world, I'd be able to survive. And I took up therapy as an occupation.
Do you mind if I ask who that was?
It was Bob Cook in Manchester. Excuse me, Manchester Institute of Psychotherapy, and Richard Erskine in America, who is getting towards the end of his life now, but still traveling around the world giving seminars and lectures, passionate, devoted to this particular way of life. So I learnt a lot from them, and what I was doing in the world of therapy didn't seem like enough, constrained by the conventions and constrained by the guidelines of the organisation that I belonged to. And it was about that time that I discovered the Mankind Project, which is an organisation that basically seeks to replicate, or not replicate, but offer something of the rites of passage that adolescent boys went through in tribal societies. Now, there's a lot of debate about that, you know, because many of those rituals were actually really quite physically gruesome. So it's not completely clear to me that this was just a rite of passage into manhood. I think there was also quite a bit of desensitizing the boys to pain so they could become warriors. And, you know, I think there's an association between the warlike nature of those tribal societies and the gruesomeness of their boyhood initiation rituals. But nonetheless, if we stick to the idea that something is needed to turn a boy into a man, it's a distinct point at which he can no longer say he's a boy, but he belongs to the men, then what MKP, I would suggest, seeks to do is to almost like flick that switch, and something happens over the course of that process. And I would liken it to a flicking of a switch that sets a man on a different path in his own development.
Because the difference is these are grown, like at least externally grown men rather than boys.
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, as many of them have been through that process would readily admit, well, I was just a boy, really, trying to be a man in the world around me. And then, you know, you hit on the first issue. Where are fathers in this world? And of course, there's a big deal around both girls and boys not being fathered, which has different consequences for each gender, but they are quite profound. And one of them, which I hope we can talk about later, is this absence of the quality of leadership, you know, in a sense of being the leader in your own life. Anyway, so having done MKP, then it became really clear to me that the way I needed to go was to look into a model of archetypal development. And these archetypal ideas seem to really resonate with everyone who comes across them. It's like we can all intuitively understand the archetypes within us.
Oh, yes. Let's pause there because, my goodness, probably one of my favorite ever conversations to have. And I know you feel very much the same about the archetypes. There's a couple of things that occurred to me. One is a question I wanted to ask you. So your original training, when you first sort of stepped into this work, wasn't archetypal in nature. It wasn't, say, for example, Jungian kind of depth psychotherapy type of model.
It was transactional analysis psychotherapy, which is very humanistic, of course, and to that degree has that compassionate sort of sense of connection with the client, as opposed to those more separated types of therapy.
So it was MKP that really kind of like opened your at least conscious mind to the archetypes. But as you say, for all of us, they are already there. It is just a matter of kind of making conscious what's there and pre-existing and, likely will always exist. And you're so right, is, people can live half a lifetime and think archetypes are irrelevant, like just have no bearing. And then when they're ready and perhaps introduced in the right way, suddenly it's like that archetype just comes alive for them. It's like they may not know the entirety of it. It may not be fully embodied. And yet there is this just like instinctual recognition and knowing of like, oh, this isn't something alien that I need to kind of intellectually now learn. This is like a remembering.
Oh, absolutely. Great word. Yes. It's a going back to what should always have been present from birth. Consciously present, as you rightly said.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah. Oh my gosh. It's just like already I'm like so excited about this conversation. So, how did and I think we'll start segue away from your story, but I'm still fascinated because again, it's like even though I know you well, some of these things we've just never really spoken about, and so I'm really fascinated to sort of see how this for you personally affected the way that you started to work. So you did MKP project as a participant, and then I know that you kind of like got more involved. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that before we start to segue more into the work itself.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. Yeah, sure. Well, it made such a difference to my life. I spoke a moment ago of the flicking of the switch, which is the analogy that I still use. And you might say, well, how on earth can that happen over the space of a weekend? And the answer is, I don't know, but it does. And so then that led me to a path of exploration. And there were all kinds of aspects, vision quests, trekking in high mountains, solitude, and so on and so on. So I was focusing on myself at that point. And of course, looking back on that seems precisely right. Several years later, I began to staff the weekends for MKP. And in some ways, that was almost more therapeutic than going through it the first time, because once you start the weekend rolling, it doesn't stop and you have to resolve interactions with other staff members and with the participants. And so it requires instant responses.
I can imagine.
Very exciting. Then I went on to follow up. There's a follow-up weekend, or now runs also as a nighttime course over 8 weeks, evening course over 8 weeks, to cement the learnings of that first weekend. And I really found that to be the place where doing group work with men, of course, as it was in that organisation, was absolutely the place I needed to be. And, this isn't a one-way thing. Of course, I was growing from that. But this is really where I learned about the archetypes. And it made that old book Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette wrote in 1990, the first modern book about archetypes. It was where it made that learning come alive. And of course, that led me to think, well, this is probably a very good way of approaching therapy. That actually people will instinctively respond to the parts of themselves because those parts have distinct functions. People know where they're not living up to their potential. So in an archetypal model, we can focus on that particular part of the personality and work with it in such a way that it becomes balanced and fully mature. And you might say, but hang on, this sounds like parts work, which is a discipline in many different types of therapy. And that's true. I mean, parts work is just a kind of archetypal work. But the beauty of what I have done and many others have done, I'm not claiming in any way it's down to me, is it's distilled down just to these 4 simple archetypes. And that makes everything seem so much simpler for a client and for the practitioner. And you've worked extensively with the archetypes, Leanne, so I'm guessing you know precisely what I'm talking about.
Oh my gosh, I really do. And there's the way I've come to see both what we're talking about here, kind of like working with the 4 archetypes in this way, but then kind of like then starting to broaden that out to other archetypes that for certain people might be the ones that kind of really unlock aspects that, you know, that they needed to work with those 4 first in whatever way is right for them in order to gain access to. It's profound, and I think profound in both, as you're saying, the simplicity that there is only these 4, but also the level of depth that then allows us to go to, because it's not to say that if, for example, we're talking about the magician, it's not to say that's going to show up the exact same way as for everyone. There's going to be these qualities that are archetypal, therefore universal, but of course the way that is experienced and shows up for each person is also unique for them. And so it allows this just like beautiful, like simplicity and yet depth, that I think is such a helpful way where it kind of brings you back all the time to this like blueprint, rather than just kind of get like, you know, as soon as we start to go into the psyche, there is this sense of like, oh my goodness, like where does this end? Where are the markers? And the archetypes are those markers. They're the pathways. They're the kind of illuminations, which also allows again this enough space that we also can understand like our own unique aspect of that. So
Absolutely.
yes, I couldn't agree more. I think there is just something so beautiful and so magical, and again so primal, so innate to our human experience in working this way.
Beautiful point. And you put your finger on something really important there. This is about humanity. This is about the essence of humanity, who we all are. Long before I'd come across the archetypes and looked at them in detail, I just knew that I had a belief, which was that we are all more similar than different, regardless of gender and age and all the rest of it. And the reason is because we're all built around what I would call these 4, I mean, people have said 8 or 12 or 20, but you know, let's stick to the simplest, not simplistic, but simplest explanation of 4 archetypes. That is the foundation of our humanity. Men, women, children, grown-ups, elders, all based on that system of archetypal structure. So no wonder there's truth in the statement, we're more similar than we are different. The irony, I think, being that the world as it's evolved, the external world I'm looking at beyond this screen and everyone else is, seems designed almost to take us away from that basic structure of humanity, to look outwards rather than inwards, to separate rather than to come together, to find antagonism rather than harmony, and so on. Which is one of the reasons I think why going back to the archetypal model is such a profound way of restoring connection in society. And also, it occurs to me as I say that, restoring connection inside a person, like connecting with those deeper parts of themselves.
Yes. I love what you've just said there. It's interesting. There's some kind of dichotomy in this modern world, in that, as you say, we're simultaneously conditioned to look out and see difference everywhere. But then also this sense of, oh, but these people are okay because they're the same as me, but all these other people are different and wrong. And yet also have this kind of, we're told there is this kind of like need to be the same, to be homogenized in certain aspects of ourselves too. It's like we are kind of seeing differences where they either aren't real and don't matter, And yet we're also not encouraged to shine a light on that kind of unique soul that we are. And so it's interesting, isn't it? It's like the least helpful of like mixes. And yeah, my sense is working the way we're talking about allows for this sense of like, we are more similar. We are built on this kind of same archetypal structure. And as well as that, I am unique. And it's like,
Absolutely.
it's both that I think this opens us up to. So without further ado, for people who are just like, okay, we'll talk about the blasted archetypes. I'm going to hand over to you, Rod, to give us
a fair point.
Yeah, give us a magical mystery tour around these 4 archetypes and what each of them shows us, activates us, guides us into.
Yeah, sure. Well, I work with a very experienced woman called Marianne Hill, who felt for some time that the classic terms which Moore and Gillette came up with in their 1990 book, which were king, warrior, magician, and lover, were too gender specific. So although you could say things like queen or leader or even heart-centered leader, that the emphasis was, well, this is a male domain. And of course, that's not true at all, as you know, because you've worked with the archetypes extensively. So Marianne has come up with equivalent names for each of the archetypes in their classic forms. So for king or queen, she likes the term heart-centered leader. And I completely agree with that, because this is so on point, heart-centered leadership. And that's not just leadership of something in the world or the family, it's leadership of one's own life, which is where I see the greatest deficit of archetypal energy in this heart-centered leader, or king or queen, if you prefer.
Or sovereign is also...
It's a great term, isn't it? And that's not to imply there's any connection with royalty as we have seen it through the generations, thank the Lord, because that's not been a great model of anything to anybody. Well, it's been a great model of many things, but not necessarily very positive. So yes, heart-centered leader, the leader in your life, if you like, the part of you, I should say, that has responsibility for what's going on, your objectives in life, how you live your life, how you relate to other people. So many qualities. I hope we can talk about that, because I have a list of them here that I wrote down just before we started in more detail later on. So I think it's probably the archetype that's weakest in the world today.
Yes. So let's do a kind of whistle-stop tour through all 4 and then come back, because I agree.
Yeah. Well, the next one is warrior, and I totally get the point that my wife made to me very quickly, which is that this is not a word that actually in the modern world is conducive to somebody saying, I've got a warrior in me. But Marianne's called it the action taker. So I think we need to evolve towards that sense of action taker in the world rather than warrior. Of course, in tribal days, warriors were essential. They had a very important function. But let's bring that up to date and say the function of the warrior is to go out in the world and make an impact. It's the first thing. The second thing that children learn about themselves is that they can or can't have an impact on the world around them. And that's the beginning of the development of their action taker. So it embodies a number of levels of action in the world, starting with the child's discovery that the child can have an impact on the world, whatever that might be. Then it goes on to a next level of assertiveness, which is, of course, standing strong in your position and stating your truth. Beyond that, I would say there's anger, which is an innate reaction. Anger is not a good emotion. Well, it can be very necessary at times. There are various distortions of anger, but in its cleanest form, it's about protecting what is rightfully yours. And more than protection, it's about establishing boundaries. And somebody infringes your boundary, it's a natural human response to feel a surge of anger. And it's that anger that can empower you to stop the boundary incursion, whether that's physical or spiritual or emotional. But then, of course, if it overinflates, it becomes rage, and that's not good for anybody. So this is, as we pass through this quick whistle-stop tour of the archetypes, we just need to acknowledge, I think, that any of them, either inflated or deflated, are out of balance and can do a lot of harm in one way or another. The obvious inflation of the warrior or action taker is road rage. And the obvious deflation of it is somebody who can't stand up for themselves, can't speak their truth, and just is basically too shy to assert themselves. So then there's good old magician, which you've worked with extensively. And for women, I think terms like priestess and sorcerer and shaman would be perhaps more on point. What do you think?
This could take us down. It might be that we do a follow-up episode, actually, because I think there's a lot of nuance that over the years I've seen in how can I put this? It's like those archetypes of the original four that kind of almost like have such a lot there for us, like a lot of shadow there, a lot of charge there. We are, for whatever reason, like have a particular kind of like predominance there. It can then open up into these kind of like rarer expressions of that. Which is then kind of come back to your question. The reason that I'm saying this is, as you know, for me, the magician was something that was so helpful to recognize in myself, but also the ways that could kind of be misused. And again, very innocently as a means of protection, but also how that was in my way. And then the more that became conscious, the more that started to, let's say, open me up to the more like magical, mystical realms of that aspect, which then more and more, it was like things like the priestess and the shaman started to come online in a way that just wasn't available to me, while I was still kind of like, really like not conscious of these different aspects of the magician, because I was using it very much to like, okay, I can work this out and keep myself safe.
Absolutely. Well said. Great point. And for me, I think one of the reasons that I have a certain skill, I'd like to believe, in archetypal work is because of that fact that I mentioned earlier on. In my childhood, I had to stay one step ahead of the world around me. And that was a development of magician, and more particularly the magician's intuition, that's allowed me to kind of be quite sensitive to what's happening in the world around me before there's any obvious sign of it. So all of those variations of the magician, it's basically about thinking and creativity and the descent into other worlds, as you rightly observed.
But for most, that isn't going to be particularly accessible, whilst, they're still stuck in this kind of almost like this lock of the energy is so distinct for me, that kind of like, oh, if I can just work all this out and keep it controlled, I'll be okay. But with that kind of grasping, just stops us accessing the other realms.
Indeed. I mean, that's the safety officer aspect of the magician. What it learns in childhood, it holds on to as a strategy for staying safe till you actually get in there and do some work with it to persuade it to update its job description. And no wonder, because in childhood, when people form strategies to stay safe, they can often be literally about life or death. Not necessarily physical death, although that's true too, but spiritual, emotional, even the aliveness of the spirit is sometimes dependent on the magician's skill.
Yes.
And of course, Marianne calls the magician the transformer, which is a very interesting take on it, because that's regarded as the ability of that archetype to transform one situation into something different. And in its inflated form, of course, it becomes the sociopath who's so adept at transformation and manipulation that it begins to extend itself to other people's lives and manipulate them. And in the deflated state, it's well, we probably all met this at school, the confused child who sits in a corner and can't answer any question, or the person who blushes immediately they're asked a question, because their strategy probably in childhood for staying safe was to stay silent and not be seen, perhaps. Yeah, and so on to the lover. Well, Marianne calls it the feeling body, and it's because it is the embodied state of us, you know. I mean, the others have aspects of embodiment. Of course they do. Warrior, you couldn't be a warrior unless you were kind of
You had a
physically
body
doing
to go
something.
with it, yeah.
Exactly. Well, I don't know. I've got a book on the shelves here called The Art of Spiritual Warfare. So
Oh, okay,
yeah. Anyway, yes, the lover. So often mistaken for the inner child, but that's not quite right. I'll explain that briefly in a moment. The lover is about connection, and it's the primal archetype. It's the one that, you know, people come out of their mum and they're greeted with either this, or God forbid, that. So either acceptance.
Would you just speak that aloud as well for those listening?
Yes.
I think there's something really profound in the body movements, which I love. But yeah, just so people really understand, like feel viscerally what you're talking about in words.
Absolutely.
As well.
Complete embrace of acceptance. The best possible start, of course. And then often, regrettably, a certain distance, a kind of hands away from the body, holding the baby at arm's length, either literally or metaphorically. And then, of course, the third option, which is the complete rejection in one way or another, for whatever reason. Often, of course, tragic reasons lead to that state of affairs. But it's on that primal acceptance and embrace that the lover's healthy development depends, because it is all about connection. And for those who don't get it, there tends to be this urge later in life to seek out connection, sometimes a very needy, quite desperate way. And that can manifest in very subtle ways. I mean, you've probably experienced this, Leanne. It's the person, you know, we're just starting a check-in at the opening of a group and somebody stands up and says something like, oh, I must just read you this poem I've written. It so beautifully expresses the work we're doing. And the only possible response to that is compassion, because what they're demonstrating is the lover wound. And of course, it can inflate beyond that to absolute codependency, I suppose, is a form of lover wound, where you can't literally survive in some way without the enmeshing with another person. The deflation of that is stoicism. I don't need anybody. What are you talking about? All this nonsense about romance. Poof, I've managed quite well without it, which is also a tragedy in its own way, because we are meant to be connected people. So in its finest form, it's the open-hearted, loving connection that we can form with other people. And, you know, I said earlier, didn't I, that I thought the kind of leader or sovereign was the most deficient archetype. As I'm saying this about the lover, I'm thinking, maybe it's the lover that's the most deficient. When you look at this separation in the world today, not just within families, but between communities and between countries. So yes, deficiency of lover energy is, I think, a big part of our difficulties.
And of course, they do go hand in hand, the lover and the sovereign, in that in order to be a heart-centered leader, there does need to be this capacity for the heart, the connection.
Very much so. That's so true. In fact, of all the archetypal links, for example, very briefly, the king gives orders to the warrior or the action taker, telling him, or queen gives orders to the action taker, telling her or him what needs to happen. In an ideal structure, the king or queen gives orders to the sorceress, priestess, magician, saying, this is the problem I have. How can you solve it for me? And the lover is about, here I am. I'm open to you. And the king can make the decision, or the queen can make the decision about, well, now, is this a safe connection? Well, that's probably partly magician as well, of course. But the one aspect of that the relationship which I think really is important is, if you imagine the responsibilities of the head of state, the queen or the king, the sovereign, it can be exhausting unless they have something to support them, because there are decisions to be made about people's welfare and strategy, and should I take this job or that job, or what do I do with my son who's not doing well at school and my daughter's staying out late at night? What do I do about this? These decisions can lead to a sense of, I suppose, exhaustion is the simplest word. And so to stop that happening, there needs to be a flow of that joyous energy from the inner child, the lover, if you like, right up to the king or queen, so that they are supported energetically. And of course, the role of the sovereign in return is to come down to the lover and set boundaries, because the lover's desire for connection is absolute and all-consuming, or can be. And that needs to be boundaried by a discerning, more adult part, if you like, of the system. Just one final word before we move on. I said there's often confusion between the lover and the inner child.
I was about to ask you that, so perfect.
Yeah, great. Well, the inner child I see as being made up of the younger parts of all of the archetypes. And it's certainly true that the further you go back in time, the more the feeling body or the lover presides. So if you go back to birth, then it's all feeling body.
Yes.
That's all that's, primary is 90% feeling body, 10% warrior. I want some food, cry. That's the action taker in its infancy. But it's all about connection and love and support. So,
and pre-verbal is all just felt.
All felt, absolutely. So it's a rough analogy to say feeling bodies were equivalent to inner child, but it's not strictly accurate.
Because these other parts that are held in the other archetypes, yes.
And so just to refine that archetypal model, of course, you can go back in those archetypes to any and every age. So, there's a complete set of memories in the brain about everything that's ever happened to us. And using archetypal counselling as therapy, whatever you want to call it, it really is possible to just get someone to access some specific incident from their childhood, which has probably been the foundation of a part of their behaviour in the rest of their life, and to work on it at that early age.
Yes, which, I've experienced in so many different ways and settings. It's almost like this is going to sound overly simple. It's as profound as I'm about to say, but it's not necessarily quite as binary as I'm about to say. But it can be when we discover those moments and go back and really understand them in a different way, in a more sovereign way. They can be a bit like a key finally being able to unlock a door.
Yeah, very much so. It's miraculous what
can really happen. Like a distinct difference.
It's fabulous, isn't it? And people tend to think that their history is fixed and can't be changed, which of course in one sense is true. You can't change the past externally, but you can certainly work on it inside your mind to come up with a different perspective and a different understanding. A child who isn't supported is using a child's mind to understand the world, and no wonder things go crazy with that, because how is that possible? So to be able to go back and to say, what if the truth was actually something very different, can be transformational and can turn somebody's perspective of themselves on that particular issue in a moment.
Yes.
Quite stunning work. Well, we did say we would focus on the leader. I'm wondering if we're ready to do that.
I think so. I do think we may need to come back and do a part 2, because I'm realising, wow, we've already we've used up so much time, and we've yet to, and I really want to kind of do justice to the heart-centered leader. So yes, let's go there now.
Okay, wonderful. Well, it's all too easy to kind of set this out as a sort of, if you're not in this state, there's something wrong with you. But the truth of the matter is very different. How could most people be in this place when we don't have parents who themselves were not in that place and could show us the example of it?
Yes.
My own father, bless him, went away to war at the age of 19, came back. His mother and father died when he was 11 and 13. I can't remember which way around that was. He was brought up by a very compassionate aunt, but, his life was, well, I was going to say destroyed. That was the word that came to mind. But I think what I mean by that is his capacity to develop this part of himself by just being around people who were leaders was just ripped away from him. And you don't learn necessarily much about true leadership in the army, except a kind of warrior command structure.
Yes.
And I think, more broadly speaking, most of us would, if we looked at our parents, many of us, I wouldn't say most, perhaps, many of us would go, yeah, well, they didn't really know how to be queen or king or leader themselves.
I would say it is most. I think
Mm.
I think once we have eyes to see what we're talking about here, the problem is the challenge is that this aspect of someone really being able to embody that leader is so rare.
That's
It's
true.
so rare.
Mm.
Even if we thought our parents were that, is we don't actually have much of a comparison to say, actually, now I understand what that actually either looks like or internally feels like, as I've done the work to embody that. I think, I mean, I'll just talk from my own perspective, and this isn't at all saying, I had terrible parents. I really didn't. They had some wonderful qualities, and I'd say, for example, my father, I think, and I'm focusing on my father primarily because it was him who raised me. I think he likely was, in many ways, far more sovereign than most people. I think he embodies so much more of what we're talking about. But now, having done the work I've done, I can see there's places where, that wasn't perhaps fully embodied. But again, I think he already was quite rare. But I would say and certainly as I've worked with people, what they start to realize, they look at their parents as they're starting to embody this leadership, see it around them. They look back at their parents and say, oh, I get that now. They just weren't there themselves. They could only do their best given the fact that they weren't. But I now realize it was so lacking.
Bang on. And I think the point that arises from that for me, Leanne, is it's a lot harder to learn it in adulthood than it is as a child when you're surrounded by it and it can just soak into your being, which is how it ought to be.
Oh, so, there's a I have to share that. I can't remember the exact quote, but Jung said something like, children learn not by what you say, but like what you do, who you are.
By who you are. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, as an ideal, as an aspiration, really, I suppose, but something to work towards, I just jotted a list down here. And I would say these are not necessarily the most important qualities, but let's say they're up in the top few. So first of all, leadership, which means having the courage to actually stand out from the crowd and be different.
Oh,
yes, indeed.
Yeah, I love that though, because there is like a real it is that, isn't it? Like we always know in any group, if we look at it in a literal sense, there is a leader and there is a distinct difference to the rest of the group.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And not only be ready to stand out in front of the crowd, but to take the projections that start coming, good and bad, and they will fly at people. And if they're not strong enough to not withstand them, it's not a matter really of withstanding, it's a matter of just not being impacted by them because they know they are good enough. This is not about perfection. It's about knowing you're good enough for what you're being called upon to do. And that knowledge that you're good enough will sustain you in the face of the projections that come flying from people who aspire to leadership but don't actually do much to work towards it.
Can I say something about this around projections? Because it's been a really big part of my own journey. The more and more I embody what we're talking about here, but kind of in an external form, where, as you say, it's like you become this projection magnet.
Yes.
And
love it.
It's been so it's been so helpful to recognize that is just how it works. Is nothing really personal. It is just it's how the archetype works. It will do that. And what's been really interesting for me is that comes in waves, in that just as you think okay, I'm good with this, this level of embodying this leadership brings these projections, and I can dance with this. And then as soon as you then step into that in a different way, a different area, a different depth, it brings a whole nother load of those projections. So I'll give you a real life example.
Go on.
I've just recently, I'm in the midst of enrolling for my upcoming circle, the Rose Quest. But to my kind of surprise and maybe slight horror, it wasn't until after I'd already opened the enrollment that I started to realize, the archetype that's talk about these kind of other archetypes as we start to get access to. The archetype that's at the heart of this is the kind of polite term is the temple priestess. The kind of more activating term might be the sacred prostitute.
Yeah.
And really looking at that kind of sort of paradox of the kind of most spiritual, but also the most sensual, the most sexual, and
Yeah.
really exploring how those can come together in union. And so I was like, oh God. And then obviously I then need to like speak about this publicly. So the podcast last week was on this topic of the sacred prostitute. And so it's been such an interesting experience for me to step into that like leadership role where I'm like standing out for the crowd, talking about this archetype, which activates the hell out of so many people, and then being in relationship to this extra level of projection. And it's so interesting witnessing like, oh, okay, this is now what I'm being invited to be in relationship with, which
Very
is different
so.
to where I was a year ago or the year before that. So it's that I find such a fascinating journey.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And it's a beautiful, beautiful example. Yeah. And, you know, when I think about that conceptually, it's like, please just give it up, people. It just is so, you know. But of course, that doesn't have much sway in the matter, does it? So what would an ideal leader who was kind of in their heart be? They would be compassionate. They would be loving. I think those are the two aspects where they're not just working for their own benefit. They're working for, the benefit of the greater good as a whole. They're not selfish in their leadership. They see the value in bringing other people up as leaders. But beyond that, clear, focused. I mean, clear is in the sense of I know what I'm doing, and I know.
Come back to sorry, I just went off on a bit of a thought tangent there. As you were talking about that kind of compassion and love that extends outside self, I was like, yeah, it's very kind of Aquarian energy where we're thinking about the greater good is kind of much more transpersonal. And I was thinking that is so, but it first has to be something that's like fully present internally for it to be truly an expression externally.
Thanks for saying that. It's so, so true. You know, people say this cliche, you know, you can't love anybody else till you love yourself. And I would put it slightly differently. You can't love anybody else truly till you've loved your own being and every aspect of it, including more particularly your inner child. So a lot of people have a terrible relationship with their inner child. You ask them to imagine it, and they'll say things like, oh, he's a little shit, or she's a little devil. I think, well, we do have work to do here because you're not going to be able to express love outwardly if you can't express it inwardly. I remember in the early days of the Israeli hostages, one woman was released who had been a peacemaker all her life. And as she passed the gunmen on the way out of the caves, she embraced the guy who'd been holding her hostage and touched him and said, Shalom, which of course means peace. And there I thought, I can feel the tears arising as I think of it. I mean, people will have different views on that. But my question would be, is it better to live in that state of peace and compassion and love, or to live in anything different to that? And I'm not offering an answer to that question, but that to me
it's a beautiful inquiry. Yeah, that was really, really moving. Thank you, Rod.
Yes, clear and focused in terms of purpose, because if there is any part of the archetypal system that's about what am I doing in the world, is the sovereign. Say, what is my mission statement? My mission statement might be to raise the best children I can in the most wholesome way possible so they become the best adults. It might be to build a business. It might be both of those things. It might be 5 different things. But the point of a mission statement, rather from being these kind of gestures of something or other towards corporate Sorry, I'll not say the word I was
Yeah, we
just
don't want to
about
mark
to
this
say.
as
No,
explicit if we don't have to. Right?
A mission statement is the kind of guiding compass. It's the objective that you can follow in your actions so that your life becomes meaningful and you're actually on a path, so that every time you swerve off that path, you can readjust back and align back to your goal, whatever that might be.
Can I add a quick sense that I
Please.
have on this? I'd love to see if you feel the same about this. There is this, like, absolutely this kind of responsibility, really, of that sovereign part to hold a clarity of where are we going? What's all this for? Where are we going towards?
Yeah.
What I've seen over the years is that kind of starts at a more, let's say, material level, as in, like, the way that I might be going with my finances or my job. But then the deeper we go with this, the more it starts to become this deeper, kind of more like soul purpose, we might say, like the
Yes.
whole reason we even came here. There is
Very
a
much
level
so.
of depth that comes through that is the kind of like deeper guiding purpose that might have these material manifestations, but it is a much deeper aspect of what we mean by purpose. But that can only really be revealed and something that we consciously hold as a North Star with all of what we're talking about kind of online and embodied.
That's very true. So yes, so the move from the practical to the spiritual is the way I would put it. Does that work for you?
Yes.
Yeah. The move from the practical to the spiritual doesn't happen instantly or even in a short time. It's a lifelong journey, I think. And it may go in fits and starts, progress and then backwards a bit and then more progress and so on and so on. But that's the nature of our evolution. And my judgment, my guess, my belief is that the reason for that is so that when we get to the point where we're transitioning out of this life to something different, whatever that may be, we can do that with ease and grace. And having witnessed both my parents dying without any ease or any grace, and I judge a lot of fear, I would say for anybody who has any sensitivity towards their own sovereign's growth, that spiritual pathway is a really important part of growing older. So that at the end of your life, there is a certain level of acceptance of death rather than a fighting against it. And it is just the way it is. And I know many people can't die an easy death because they're in pain, because they have conditions that make it so. But it's something about the acceptance of that transition rather than the process that I think is the product of a spiritual sovereign in later years.
I love that. It reminds me, actually, one of the ways that Jonathan and I sometimes speak about the work we do is it's to live fully and die complete. And
Beautiful.
it's not necessarily about kind of, doing all the things on your bucket list. It's a deeper sense of like living fully into that myth that you came here to live, so that one might die in a sense feeling of like, I am complete, which another way of saying it is just you saying it's an acceptance. I did what I came here to do.
Precisely. That's exactly the phrase on my lips. What am I here to do? Yeah. So anyway, let's just quickly go through a few more. Well-boundaried, the sovereign in her fullest form, well-boundaried, knowing exactly where responsibility begins and ends. And in other words, being able to accept there are things that she or he might be able to help with or even change, but knowing where their responsibility stops. And just being able to accept, I can't do anything about that, but I can do something about this. And that's the quality of discernment about what's important and what's not her responsibility or his responsibility. But as I say, I think more than anything, knowing she's good enough, knowing he's good enough is the key to being a strong sovereign. And that's an embodied sense of, I'm fine the way I am. It's not about what I do. Quick anecdote. On one of the workshops, we were talking about this with the participants, and a woman stood up and said, when I came home from school, she was Singaporean, where there's a massive achievement culture. If I had 98% on a test, my father would say, if you'd tried harder, you'd have got 100%. He never once praised me for what I'd achieved. So I said, and what do you think would have satisfied him? She said, I think if I'd become an astronaut, he'd have been pleased. And then I thought, I didn't say it. Yes, but he wouldn't have, because if you said you were on a mission to Mars, if you were an astronaut who'd been selected for the International Space Station, let's say, he would have simply come back with, if you'd tried harder, you'd have been on the mission to Mars. But a child growing up in that environment where nothing is good enough, how on earth are they going to incorporate a sense of being good enough into their sense of self? Well, with a lot of work in adulthood, of course.
Yes.
And other qualities, integrity and authenticity, more than anything, I think, to be that kind of heart-centered, genuine, compassionate, sovereign. Integrity meaning I am who I say I am, I do what I say I will do, I keep my commitments. And authenticity being real at all times. Incredibly hard thing to do. Particularly if you have a skillful sorcerer magician who's told you that the best way to survive is by adopting a different kind of way of being in the world.
Yeah, that's a huge one. Just to say, we're about to, we might already be in the midst of it by the time this goes out, but we're each month in our Academy of Soul, Unio, we do a different monthly quest. So all of us journey with a particular, it could be all sorts. It could be an archetype. It could be a particular characteristic. It could be all sorts of things. And the one that we're about to start next week is around truth. And it's like that medicine of like honesty and trust and all these ways that we aren't going to be that. It's going to be, I'm already excited because I'm like, oh my gosh, you know, the places that we kind of like, oh, the truth is excruciating. So yeah, it ties right into that.
Absolutely. I'm smiling as I say it because it's so on point. So, you know, I mean, there are many more we could go through, which leads me to say, here's a question for you and me and for everyone. If our queen or king or sovereign or heart-centered leader is not running our realm, our world, our responsibility, who is in charge? Is it the warrior, the action taker, driving us to death by working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, or just taking on impossible workloads? Is it the lover who's having us sit on a cushion meditating for several hours a day and thinking that the world is blissful? No disrespect there. I mean that genuinely. I understand why people adopt that approach to life, but if you inflate one archetype at the expense of the others, you're not a well-rounded, balanced person. And I also accept totally that people will say, well, that's my path, but it's not my belief system. And if it's not your lover, is it your magician, constantly thinking out ways to get one up on people or survive or get the advantage or the upper hand or to stay safe? Be any or all of them, couldn't it, really? But the absence of the sovereign, that's the key to, I think, a happy life, actually. I'd go as far as to say that, really. Yeah.
I would really agree. I think that's a beautiful inquiry to end this episode with. And again, I would really encourage anyone listening that wants to enter that inquiry to do so with that, from that energy of the sovereign, from that place of love and compassion, because we see so much more when we're able to do that than if we go out on a witch hunt. As
Yeah,
soon as
of
we go on a
course.
witch hunt, things hide.
That's
Whereas if
great.
we're kind of like there, like come show me, I'd love to see you. We get to see
Absolutely.
so much more. And I'll share personally, and I know this, Rod, and you've already said the same is true for you. It was such a revelation to me to realize, like, oh, my magician is basically like there thinking she's on the throne, running the whole show. And
Mm,
it was so clear to me, like that's what's happening.
yeah.
And it was what was needed until it wasn't, but it was so clear. And I think that's often the case. As you say, there might be a bit of a mix, but I think most of us have this predominant flavor where we're kind of
Yeah.
more one or the other, or one of the
Mm,
three. And I think there is something so helpful to recognize that about ourselves.
yeah. Well, I'm going to do a little bit of self-promotion, if that's okay with you.
Please do. In fact,
This,
before you do that, I want to ask you a question, which I think will lead
yes,
on very nicely.
go
So
ahead.
I know that you've, in fact, let's both show, for those of you watching, your
Thank you.
fabulous.
Well, fabulous. It's kind of you to say so. Fabulous new book.
Fabulous new
Thank you.
book.
I'll take
Um,
that.
but because I know that it isn't the first book you've written on this topic, what
Hmm.
had you write this new one?
Warrior, Magician, Lover, King, I'm just going to hold that up, which was the first one I wrote, was,
Mm-hmm.
I suppose, what I felt. I wrote it in 2018. I think that was part of my journey at the time, that actually I thought a lot of people would benefit from knowing about this internal structure, because it would help them understand how they operate, these four archetypes. And the feedback I've got does seem to bear that out. I get emails from people who've read it saying it was a revelation, and I get a lot of emails from women saying, now at last I'm beginning to understand what's going on with him, whoever he is, son, brother, husband, partner, whatever. But I think since 2018, my awareness has become, this is the one that the world needs more than anything. And for King, read Queen. Because although this book...
Would you say, for those listening, say
Yes,
the title?
Finding the King Within. How to access and embody the leadership, power and authority of your inner king archetype. Finding the King Within. It's on Amazon.
Great title.
Thank you. And although there's a picture of a man on the front, because the book is primarily aimed at men, there's no question that women will be able to read this and see themselves in every page. Because, like I said at the start of our conversation, we really are more similar than different, no matter what the world would have us believe. And so, for example, these 40 or so qualities that I've put down as traits of the king or queen are equally applicable to men and women. I think it's most of the book is actually about these qualities that I see as making up this archetype. And as I say, I think it equally applicable to both genders and those of no gender. It's a human thing, not a thing that's delineated by sex or sexuality or gender. So there we are, finding the king, cross it out. Right, finding the queen within on the cover. And enjoy.
Wonderful. And where else could people find you? Is there a website or anything like that you'd also like to share?
Yes, I've got a couple of websites. The best one, which will lead you elsewhere, is takeyourpower.co.uk.
Yeah, also, great name.
Takeyourpower.co.uk. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, why not? Because isn't that the invitation that's implicit in all of this? That actually each one of us, in a way, even has a responsibility to take our power. And don't think I'm naive enough to not know that there are a lot of people struggling to just survive in the world. Even so, even a little bit more king or queen in their life would change their way of coping, I suspect, and make it more
Yes,
easy. Yeah.
I would wholeheartedly agree. Well, Rod, this has been an immense pleasure, even more than I was anticipating, actually. And we've this has ended up being a slightly longer episode than usual, and yet it's flown by. And I feel like we had so much more that we could journey with. So, yes, I think there could be an excuse to come back and do a second episode and go kind of even deeper into some of these explorations.
I would be absolutely delighted, Leanne, and it's such a pleasure to see you again after such a long gap in our work together. But thank you. I appreciate the invitation, and I hope what I've said is of some use and some interest to your listeners and viewers.
I'm absolutely certain it will be. Thank you so much, Rod. I very much hope you enjoyed watching that. And if you did and you're not already subscribed, then do hit that bell thingy and subscribe to automatically get each fresh new episode as it's released each week. If you'd like to find out more about the work we do at Be Mythical to guide and support old souls in this new world to live their own unique myth, do hop along to bemythical.com and you'll find out all the ways you can join us and go deeper with us on your own mythical journey. Lots of love for now. Mwah. See you again next week.